Welcome to the Tank Magazine podcast. This is Josie Mitchell. Today, we'll be listening back to a conversation hosted at Tank as part of our book talk series, where writer Natasha Lennard and BBC journalist Razia Iqbal discuss Natasha's book, Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life. Published earlier this year by Verso, the book contains a series of pieces ranging from the London riots to the protests at Standing Rock to debating the moral right to euthanasia. Combining an intimate, personable tone with a fierce belief in systemic change, the essays together articulate a vision of what non-fascist living might consist in.
Natasha, let's start by talking about, I think in the first place, let's just get you to read. Why don't we get you to read from the introduction? Because that will give people a sense of her prose style and the concerns that she deals with in the essays.
So yeah, I'm just going to read from my brief introduction to give you a sense of the terrain the book is trying to engage with. I was attending a memorial in late 2016. The previous night, an old friend had been thrown from a car when, swerving to avoid a deer carcass, the vehicle flipped on a Wisconsin highway. He had been en route to join the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock in North Dakota. I met Clark in 2010, about a year after I'd moved to New York from London for graduate school. We were part of a book club called the Anti-State Communist Reading Group, or something to that dramatic effect. The friendships forged there became the foundation of an anarchist-leaning cadre, which helped fuel Occupy Wall Street with radical leftist, sometimes blustery energy. Rake-thin, beanstalk-tall, mustachioed and grinning, Clark was a mischievous and above all generous activist. We were thick as thieves for a long time, but drifted apart in the years before his death. No animosity, we chose different projects, different organizing spaces. Far-left organizing in New York had cleaved along ideological and personal lines. But the presence of Clark's absence, or his absent presence, was reason enough for a splintered scene to come together that winter night. It was the evening of November the 8th, 2016. We weren't looking at our phones, and I didn't see the infographic maps of the United States turning red. Donald Trump took Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, Florida before midnight Eastern time. We drank to our friend and lit candles, oblivious. We are pressed on each other. We will be told at once of anything that happens. So wrote poet George Oppen in his 1968 work of Being Numerous. And it's truer now, thanks to techno-capital, than when that poem was written. But that night, in a little bookshop, pressing together for those few hours, we were not told at once of the results rolling in. More lines from that same poem. It is the air of an atrocity, an event as ordinary as a president, a plume of smoke visible at a distance in which people burn. Before he died, Clark wrote a political call of sorts in a scribbled note. Live how we want to. Account for real needs and desires whilst making 1,000,001 sacrifices. Do anything for each other. Fight so hard we don't feel as if we're going to explode all the time. Make that the great American pastime again. An invocation towards non-fascist life, written before the shuddering fact of President Trump. I begin here with election night, not because this collection is organized around it. A number of the essays were written some years before Trump's ascendance, a number written after. It is unavoidable, though, that it haunts every piece, compiled as they are in this moment of emboldened racist fascism. But I bring up election night here, my election night, shaped as it was by a very different type of loss and haunting, to invoke the idea of accidents. In a sense, accidents are the proper subject of this book. I don't mean happenstances or missteps. Too many liberal commentators frame our political moment as a baffling mistake, history taking a wrong turn. I mean accident as it was used by the late theorist Paul Virilio, the accident which is contained within and brought into the world by the inventions of progress or what gets hailed as progress itself. Virilio applied the concept of accident to technological advancement and its logic of acceleration, but the idea is useful broadly when looking at the operations through which society, selves, and power are produced and organized. For example, if the current growth of fascism is an accident, in the sense cribbed from Virilio, it is not because it is a diversion, antithetical to liberal capitalism. The accident was baked into the context. Liberal centrism is conservative. Many progressive victories claimed by its adherents were built on the back, at least in part, of decades-long radical struggle. Liberal centrists cling to a paradoxical progress of conservation. Its believers seem to long for the halcyon delusions of pre-November the 8th, 2016. The chants go up. America was always great. It never was. Not my president. He is. The New York Times proclaims, truth can't be manufactured. It can, it is, and the Times should know. The Washington Post's new tagline, democracy dies in darkness. It dies in broad daylight too. Unwilling to reckon with the accidents attendant on innovations they otherwise applaud, which are not mistakes, centrist ideologues fail to offer weapons, let alone a sturdy shield against the fascism of the state, the white supremacist constellations it encourages, and the micro-fascisms that permeate daily life and habit. This book is, I hope, a call for better weapons and an expansive understanding of the battlefield where oppressive systems hold territory in ever more brutal ways.
Okay, so in the context of Paul Virilio, let's talk about terms first of all. The term anti-fascism is a difficult one, a troublesome one. How would you define it for us?
So I suppose to define anti-fascism, it's kind of more important to delineate what I mean by fascism. So what would be the kind of counterpoint to that? During Trump's electoral ascendance and here around the Brexit vote and, with a lot of electoral victories of the extreme far right in Europe, there was a cottage industry in the media of questions about, is Donald Trump a fascist? Will he usher in a fascist regime? Are we walking into a new state of fascism? And almost across the board, that commentariat presumed fascism as only constituted in state regimes that might somehow resemble kind of mid-early 20th century fascism. And of course, anything that might reconfigure itself as a fascist assemblage today will look different. And I don't particularly find it useful to have this very, very strict formal definition of X, Y, Z, things that need to be in place to say, this is fascism, and then across that line or one thing removed, it's not. I'm more interested in quite a capacious understanding of it. There seems to be this panic that in using the term too readily, we disempower it or we drain it of all its meaningful implications. And I don't believe that's true. There are many, many concepts that we use in daily life, in political discourse, that are not clean and easily definable and are malleable and movable. But we use them and we know what we mean by when we use them. And this idea, I think, was best put by Ludwig Wittgenstein when he talked about the concept of family resemblance, framings of naming things. So we use the word game very comfortably, obviously. We can say, oh, that's a game, let's play a game. Do you want to play a game of X with me? But actually, there's no one definition of the word game that will explain and define every possible occurrence of a thing that we apply the word game to. We could say it's teams, but no, you can play a game on your own. You could say there's a winner, no, you can draw. There's all kinds of things that we call a game because of a Venn diagram of connected similarities and semblances. And I think fascism works the same way, and the Italian writer Umberto Eco pointed this out in the 90s. You can look at a set of interconnecting tendencies and habits and practices and policies, nationalist racism, xenophobia, violent misogyny and transphobia, military desirousness, demagoguery. But I feel like if you took a couple of those things out, it doesn't mean it's not fascism. It's important to look for the way these things assemble, how they collectively build, how they get fueled, and how we intervene with that. And so in this book, and particularly in the first essay, I'm interested in building on the ideas of philosophers and thinkers like Wilhelm Reich, and then after that, Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, and Félix Guattari, who are invested in what is it about life under capitalism and the desires produced for domination and the operations of that sort of oppressive desire to oppress, desire to be in an oppressive system that are so generated such that fascist collectivity becomes desirable. And it's an attempt to intervene with that old notion that people en masse are duped into fascist states, fascist groupings. What is it that's desirous, and how do we intervene with that? And with that understanding, I'm interested in an anti-fascism that is not necessarily a formal political party, and is not necessarily just what we often call Antifa, which is, for those of you not engaged with this sort of thing, you know, the black hoods and bandanas and the punching of the Nazis, which we can go on to say why I'm okay with that. I think it's about interrogating the ways in which those desires for domination, those kind of brutal, racist, sexist, misogynistic, homophobic, nationalist hierarchies get entrenched in everyday life. And,
okay,
sorry, that was long.
It was, but it was good to have, because that's the thing that I really want to explore, the way in which it's possible for us to live a non-fascist life. But before we dig a little bit deeper with that, I want to start with your point of departure in that first essay, which is the responses to the Antifa punch into Richard Spencer's face, the neo-Nazi, and how that contributes to a discussion about the way in which we counter fascism. So you mentioned very briefly, you alluded to the fact that you're okay with a neo-Nazi being punched in the face, and clearly that is a kind of headline-grabbing position to take. So for those who haven't read that first essay, tell us why you are okay with somebody punching him in the face.
So, I mean, the defense that's often given by people who engage in that sort of anti-racist direct action and confrontation is it's a form of self-defense, community self-defense. There is an inherent violence in fascistic neo-Nazi ideology. It is genocidal in its very underpinnings. It's not accidentally violent. So you can frame an anti-fascist counter-violence as defensible on those terms. I kind of want to push a little deeper and say the idea that the best way to respond to these sort of fascist practices and fascist collectives is to debate, to be civil, talk to them. Let's put Richard Spencer on a stage and have a chat. I have a problem with that because I think it legitimizes that sort of discourse, but I also think it misunderstands how fascism is fostered and fueled. And I think that is often not about reason. I don't think people are reasoned in to racist fascism. I think it works in a very, very communal, desirous, poisonous collectivity that can flourish well online, well in rallies, group practices, marching with tiki torches, shouting blood and soil, Jews will not replace us. And if you understand that that is what underpins the fostering of fascism, it makes more both philosophical and rational sense to have a counteraction and an intervention that is confrontational, that shuts it down, that takes away the oxygen and disenables those sort of desires and habits to permeate, whilst all the while understanding that, while most of us, thank goodness, don't become neo-Nazis, a lot of us have, or anything, or even, Tory voters. All of us are able under late capitalism to know what those kind of desirous dominations and hierarchies are. And so obviously we don't walk around punching each other in the face or punching ourselves in the face.
But when Richard Spencer was punched in the face, the thing that you deal with at the beginning of the first essay is the mainstream media's response to the confrontational violence that you're saying is the only way, or one of the ways in which you can counter what underpins fascistic thought and movement. So just talk us through what shocked you about the way in which people responded to that violence.
Well, there's so much discourse in the way we talk about history, and especially the way people do talk about Nazis, and Richard Spencer is indeed a neo-Nazi. And in the most mainstream of discourse, you have people saying, my grandfather fought in the war and killed Nazis. And I'm like, well, this is a Nazi, and he got punched. So that, to me, was a sort of surprise. And I think the way it surprised me, too, was this presumption that everyone was sort of anti-fascist enough by just saying, I don't like Nazis, and I don't like him. And I'm not saying... I found some joyfulness in watching his horrible face get punched, and I don't have an aversion to that. But I also think it has, Antifa tactics of that ilk have proven successful against those sort of Nazi rallies, Nazi groupings. His college tour, because of Antifa action, was cancelled, not because people debated him politely on college stages. So I think it's this, I call it historical NIMBYism. So radical interventions and deplatforming of neo-Nazis is fine if it's at least 30 years ago, there and then. People celebrate the hairdresser, Vidal Sassoon, who was a member of a really quite violent anti-fascist fighting gang in post-war London, Jewish post-war, post-military service fighting gang fighting against Oswald Mosley's black shirts. People, they praised him in the obituary. And that group's motto was maim, not kill. So I think there's a kind of interesting ability to demand quite often quite useless civility in today and celebrate it as long as it's about 20 years ago or in a different country. And I found that a little galling.
So let's drill a little deeper in the sorts of tools that you think it's possible for each and every one of us. If we are to accept what Wilhelm Reich says, that there is the fascist in each of us, if we are really to be honest and truthful about examining our both dependency on the capitalist framework and the fact that we are utterly able to absorb the way in which fascist thinking can work on us psychologically. What are the tools that you think are necessary for each individual in this room and beyond that might help us to at least check we don't cultivate fascistic thinking?
Yeah, no, I think it's tricky. And I think I like a framework that talks of things in terms of habits, tendencies, like anti-fascisting as a verb, fascisting as a verb, as opposed to I'm an anti-fascist, you're a fascist. And so I think it's largely about awareness of the sort of hierarchies that do organize the world in which we live and how much we accept them and to what extent and what those consequences are. And at what point can we, both for ourselves and communally for each other, make those consequences intolerable and find something better, a better sort of collective living, a challenge to the most oppressive hierarchies. And I think it has to be a communal project. I think the risk in this, talking about the fascism, the micro-fascisms in one's head is you think, oh, okay, so I just sit with myself and just think good, non-hierarchical, oppressive thoughts. And I think that's not what I mean. I think when we talk about habits, they have to be communal habits and collective habits. And that's what I mean by a kind of form of life that we would need to collectively work on together and understand the way the privileges and hierarchies that I certainly have, a lot of people in this room have, if not all of us, are oppressing many, many other people, and leaving room for that, challenging those privileges, letting them go, and listening to the people that we're oppressing.
Let's just fill in a little biographical detail, because in your introduction that you read, you mentioned the New York Times in a very barbed way. Now, you used to be an employee of the New York Times, and it's, for a short period of time. But the reason I bring it up is that I think it's interesting to examine the way in which the mainstream media covers both Trump and all the issues that you're talking about, but also the way in which you are intervening with that coverage. And let's look at specifically the definitions of both riots and rioting, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement, both of which you write about in this book. Talk us through your difficulty with the way in which the mainstream media engages with any challenging of the status quo, whether it's in the Black Lives Matter movement or in any kind of rioting. For example, the 2011 riots in London.
Sure, absolutely. So the brief biographical point about the Times, I wasn't an employee, but I was a freelancer for them. I was very young, 23, straight out of grad school, and it was during Occupy Wall Street, which I was also organizing for and with, which one of my editors knew and kind of didn't care. But then when it became quite public that was true, we parted ways, but in a way that was definitely, emboldened me to say, no, I don't want to play this, what passes as objective game, which objectivity getting quashed into this framework of two-sidesism. So it's, horrible banks being bailed out, but maybe that's okay, but then also these horrible ragamuffins sitting in a park because they don't like it. What madness. And I think, so that was the sort of entry into that, and I've been always an opinion writer and essayist since. I do reporting, but with an agenda. And I think the way we see the real problem of that sort of both sidesism and that being allegedly an objective truth-telling, but misses
the way we see it at the BBC.
Right. Well, yeah,
exactly
you must have
that.
to deal with it all the time, and I'm sure you have many stories, and please share them. But, when, for example, when the London riots, at the height of the London riots, David Cameron said, this is criminality pure and simple. And there is nothing pure and simple about an entire city of young people rising up. We saw the same thing in Ferguson and Baltimore in the riots for Black life. And there were so many appalling critiques, not just from the right, not just from police unions, from people who would say that they were anti-racist, from liberals largely, who said, I like protest, but this has gone too far. Why are they, destroying their own communities? And essentially it was asking people whose life is organized by violence, state violence, racist violence, classist violence, to the point of necropolitics, organized in a proximity to death, as the death of Michael Brown lying in the street for 4 hours made quite clear, as the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore made quite clear. And I think what that proves is how often these media narratives truly mislocate violence. They put it on these rioters, these disruptive protesters. Some people preferred the word uprising. I can go either way. You can either say rioting is just a slur, so we should get rid of it, or we defend it. I'm happy with either, but I like uprising. These were uprisings. Violence is the background. There is no possibility of a non-violence in somewhere like Ferguson, because violence is the background state of affairs. Violence is the state status quo as in relation to particularly poor Black people in America and here too. And I think to then say, these kids, these communities turned violent, that violent turn, which is such a media phrase, really misses that this was always violent. What we are seeing when we see riots is a counter-violence. The voice of the unheard is what MLK Jr. called riots. And I cite in the book a phrase that was not written in relation to riots at all, but it struck me at the time. Philosopher Bernard Williams said, "To say peace when there is no peace is to say nothing." And I was like, yeah, that's true. Like, you can't demand peace from people who can't enter it. They can't live within peace. And so you say, why not end the cycle? I mean, how dare comfortable liberals put it on the very people who need to make a radical intervention just to draw attention to, example, the fact of police violence, and then demand that they be polite? I mean, Angela Davis famously said in the 70s, you know, you ask me about violence, that doesn't make any sense. My community is hassled by the police, killed, locked up every single day, and then, you know, white liberals say, please be peaceful. And
the focus on the destruction of property as well is the thing that the white liberal media, if you like, will always focus on, as they did in the commentary post the 2011 riots here, but also in Ferguson and so on.
Yeah, and also during the inauguration protest in the US, Trump's inauguration day, there was, you know, a lot of this property damage, not always, but like often you see targets like a convenience store or a bank window or a Starbucks. And so you have to ask, like, who are the victims of that? I've personally never heard a window scream. But it's not just because these things are inanimate that I don't want to locate violence in that, a breaking of a quick trip window, for example, in Ferguson. I just don't feel that an insured window of a Starbucks has real victims. It's not because it's inanimate. For example, a desecrated synagogue or a mosque produces victims. So it's not that I don't think violence can exist in the destruction of property, but it's curious how invested both the state and so much media is in a kind of distressed response to the breaking of a window of many institutions that are either symbols of inequality and access people can't have, or actually perpetuate those inequalities, like bank windows is often a favorite target.
How much hope do you have, given that you live in America and you are presenting arguments that are so counter to the mainstream commentariat? How hopeful are you of the ability of people to engage with the perspectives that you're presenting?
I mean, I'm hoping that because in this book, I try and work through kind of a philosophical defense of things rather than just a rah-rah, let's go. So I hope that even if people don't think they're going to agree with me, and they might not, that they can at least kind of wrestle with the logic of it. Actually, funny enough, in America right now, even though, you know, the Times will be Timesy, and I know there's a Times editor here, and he's doing great, so that's okay. But actually, a good point, like, you know, this editor friend of ours is, you know, we're seeing in the opinion section some really serious leftist thought. Yes, it's the opinion section, and a lot of the leftist writing and writers that came of age during Occupy and in the last 9 years have actually really shaped the American media ecosystem to both fill it with leftist journals, magazines, but also have infiltrated so much of the kind of traditional media. And that's good to see, even though it's just kind of making headway. And you also see how that is reflected in the kind of growth of things like the Democratic Socialists of America and the election of candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or an amazing election victory today of a woman called Tiffany Caban, who will be the head prosecutor of Queens in New York. And she has said she will no longer allow prosecutions for sex work, for low-level drug crimes, for essentially the crimes of poverty. And so that we are seeing these mainstream inroads, but obviously at a very, very disturbing time, and it's hard to know what to do.
But when we go back to definitions, you mentioned AOC, and, you know, she came under so much opprobrium recently by talking about the border centres as concentration camps. And all the people in mainstream media took issue with her use of the term concentration camps. What was your take on, you know, given that the chief official has now resigned and that these children who are being kept in the most horrific conditions have been moved, albeit to tents, which aren't particularly any better. But I just wonder about this idea of who defines the narrative. If somebody like her talks about US policy as being akin to concentration camps, and she just gets deluged by people saying, including Jewish groups, saying, how dare you use that term? Yeah.
Well, interestingly, it was only kind of conservative Jewish groups that really went for her. A huge number of historians and experts on Nazi concentration camps said, no, she's right. These are people held without access to trial in militarized circumstances, and they can't leave. And the conditions, especially for the children, have been named by the UN as well as torturous. Denied soap, toothbrushes, no lights off, sleeping on concrete, triple the amount of people in one room that should be, sometimes 9 times more. I think they're absolutely concentration camps, and why I think it matters is more than semantic. How we identify and how we bestow identification disciplines how we act. And I think it is useful to act with the utmost gravity at this point. And I don't understand a reservation in naming something as what we might call evil and invoking a history of evil that obviously no concentration camps begin as death camps. And I'm not saying we're moving into death camps. I'm saying there are concentration camps, there is torture. There was torture before. Children have been incarcerated for a long time in this country and in America. But we are watching a very, very upsetting acceleration that I am in no interest of pulling back the outrage and the rage that it should provoke.
We haven't really dealt with 2 of the most personal essays in the collection, and I think people would be interested to hear a little bit about them. The second essay in the book is about the presence of a ghost in your family home bathroom, or your bathroom in your family home. Just outline for us the way in which you frame your engagement with the presence of that ghost philosophically.
Right, so my ghost, the reason I talk about my ghost is sort of because I can't talk about my ghost. It's an invocation to start thinking about the things that we can believe in and not believe in the same time. Why is that important? I think leaving room for ontological ambiguity, what gets to exist in the world, shouldn't be limited by a framework, which is a sort of, Enlightenment modernist framework that tries to make the world and its scripts as small as possible. And, the history of that is deeply colonialist. And I think there are many scripts by which we can read the world together and usefully. And I say in that essay, intimacy resides in those places that we could explain away, but we choose not to. And instead, we invite each other to have different aspects of how the world could work, or could be, or what could be there. And there is a philosophical underpinning to this. An analytic philosopher, W.V. Quine, talked about webs of belief and how they can be shifted and made applicable as long as they remain coherent together. And that includes a web of belief in which my ghost both does and does not exist. That's feasible. And it's interesting as a kind of philosophical and ethical exercise to leave room for, I suppose, the impossible from within the terrain of the possible. So what does it mean within the confines of the frameworks we have now and the ideologies we have now, to leave room for that which we can't quite imagine because it's outside of those conceptual frameworks. But there's almost an ethical imperative to work towards opening spaces for that, both politically, personally, ethically. And so my ghost is sort of a heuristic to talk about that. But yeah, you'll get to know my ghost if you read the book.
And the very last essay in the book is about suicide.
Yes.
And I bring it up because you've written about it and it's in the public domain, but it's
not a
also
secret.
because it's not a secret, but also because the essay ends in the most beautiful, joyful, optimistic vein. And I sort of feel like it's important that we perhaps close the session by you just talking a little bit about why you chose to write about suicide and how you end that particular essay.
Sure. So another little biography is that I've actually had 2 quite serious suicide attempts, taking too many pills, whatever I had around me. And again, there's one of those ways that it can be fully pathologized and explained in medicalized terms. I'm diagnosed bipolar. I was in an abusive marriage. XYZ, and that's all true. But I'm interested in the ways in which our agency over ourselves and our sovereignty is often more blurry than we would like. So if I say I meant to die, I don't know if that quite sits truly, but nor is it kind of enough for me to be like, oh, I was just mad. Oh, I was just having an episode. I'm curious about that, where you locate this agential I and our intentionality and how that can be fuzzy and why we need sort of each other and hopefulness to understand that it's not just on us and our own intentions about how we live and maintain life. So I think that's sort of one of those things I took away from my, death proximal experiences, the messiness of intentionality in these quite desperate sites. And then at the end, it's the simple things of being with love and people I care about, and leaving room to appreciate that, touch and togetherness, and wanting to breathe and live through that. And I know that's not always enough, but I think I end with talking about being with my best friend when she was sick, and then actually being with an ex-boyfriend who was shit, but it was affirming at the time, just to sort of be in proximity with people you care about and feel life and forms of life together and continuing to live. And I suppose that's the sort of baseline to start building non-fascist life together.
Perfect note on which to end. And if the past hour hasn't convinced you that she is an original voice and an astute thinker, I don't quite know where you were sitting and concentrating. Natasha, thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry, I do go on a bit.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, subscribe on iTunes or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.